Put in a third computer, and it'll fail just like the first two. The words came from beyond the yellow safety line, quiet enough that no one inside Bay should have heard them, yet every head turned. Lead Systems engineer Ethan Cole stood beside the open electronics compartment of Sabre 12, one hand still resting on a diagnostic cart worth more than most houses. Behind him, the M1A2 Abrams sat beneath the hard white lights of the maintenance hangar, 70 tons of armor, turbine power, and stubborn silence. Its second replacement control computer had been installed less than 10 minutes earlier. For 3 seconds, every indicator on Ethan's display had glowed green. Then the warning tone sounded again. A flat electronic pulse. The main screen flashed red. System fault. Ethan looked toward the speaker. Walter Mercer stood near the hangar entrance in faded work pants, a brown canvas jacket, and boots polished by use rather than inspection. He was 79, white-haired, narrow through the shoulders, and holding an old leather tool bag with one darkened handle. He did not look impressed by the tank, the computers, or the cluster of engineers surrounding it. He looked as though he were listening to something far away. "Who are you?" Ethan asked. Walter's pale eyes stayed on the Abrams. Someone who heard the problem. A few technicians exchanged glances. One of them almost smiled. Ethan did not. The brigade readiness evaluation began before sunset, and Sabre 12 was the command tank. If it failed inspection, the entire company would be marked non-operational. Ethan had already authorized 2 replacement computers, 2 full wiring inspections, and a complete software reload. Every report carried his name. "You heard a fault in a digital fire control network from 40 feet away?" he asked. Walter stepped closer to the safety stripe, but did not cross it. "I heard what happened before the computer complained." Ethan folded his arms. "The computer is the problem." "No," Walter said. "The computer is reporting the problem." The distinction landed harder than his tone suggested. Sergeant Claire Bennett, standing beside the turret access platform, looked from Walter to the red diagnostic screen. She was the only person who did not seem amused. Ethan pointed toward the door. "This is a restricted maintenance area. We have certified specialists working here." Walter nodded once, as if the information were useful but unimportant. "Then ask one of them why the fault only appears after the turret moves." The hangar grew still. Ethan glanced at the data log. The initial startup had passed. The warning had appeared 8 seconds after the turret alignment test. He looked back at Walter. "Lucky guess." Walter's fingers tightened slightly around the leather handle. "Turn the turret left. Bring it back toward center. Stop at 2 degrees short." Ethan stared at him. Somewhere overhead, a ventilation fan hummed against the summer heat. "And then what?" Walter's gaze settled on the tank's steel flank. "Then count to 5. Ethan held Walter's gaze for a moment, then turned toward the control station. "Run the sequence," he said. Sergeant Claire Bennett climbed onto the access platform and placed one hand on the turret control panel. The electric drive engaged with a low mechanical hum. Above them, the turret began to rotate left, slow and smooth beneath the hard white lights. Walter did not watch the display. He watched the narrow seam below the rear electronics housing, his head tilted slightly, listening past the ventilation fans and the muted voices of the technicians. "Bring it back," he said. Claire reversed the control. The turret moved toward center. 2 degrees short, Walter added. Claire stopped it exactly where he had asked. For 1 second, nothing happened. Ethan looked toward Walter with the beginning of a satisfied smile. Walter counted softly. 1, 2, 3. A faint click came from inside the tank. 4. The warning tone sounded on 5. Red light washed across the diagnostic screen. The same fault code returned. No one laughed this time. Ethan stepped closer to the monitor and opened the event log. His fingers moved quickly across the controls. "The system detected an invalid lock signal," he said. "That still points to the control computer." Walter shook his head. "It points to what the computer was told." The lock sensors passed inspection, while the vehicle was standing still. Ethan looked up. Walter nodded toward the Abrams. "You tested each switch with the turret parked and the housing open. You proved the parts could work. You did not prove they would work together when 70 tons of steel started moving." Claire studied the timing graph. 2 signals appeared almost simultaneously, then separated for less than half a second before the shutdown. "There is a disagreement between the mechanical lock and the electronic confirmation," she said. Ethan leaned over her shoulder. A software delay. Maybe, Claire replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Walter moved to the yellow line and lowered his leather tool bag to the concrete. He still did not cross. Run it again, but keep your hand on the rear interlock cover. Ethan gave him a hard look. Why? Because vibration leaves fingerprints. One of the technicians glanced at Claire. She waited for Ethan's approval. The deadline was moving closer. Outside the open hangar doors, afternoon sunlight stretched across the concrete, turning the heat above the motor pool into a silver shimmer. In less than 2 hours, evaluators would arrive. Ethan finally nodded. Claire climbed higher, braced one hand against the steel housing, and repeated the sequence. The turret turned left, returned toward center, and stopped. This time she felt it. A small tremor beneath her palm, followed by a delayed mechanical tap. The warning sounded again. Claire looked down at Walter. There are 2 movements, she said. There should only be one, Walter replied. Ethan stared at the housing, his confidence narrowing into concentration. The computer records a complete lock. For an instant, Walter said. Then something slips back. Ethan folded his arms, but there was less certainty in the gesture now. What slips? Walter's eyes remained on the narrow steel cover. Open that assembly, and I will show you where your expensive problem begins. Ethan did not move. The warning tone faded, leaving only the deep hum of the ventilation system and the ticking of hot metal cooling beneath the lights. That assembly is sealed, he said. Opening it without a confirmed fault means stopping the inspection process and documenting every fastener we remove. Walter looked at the red display, then at the steel cover beneath Claire's hand. You have replaced 2 control computers without finding the fault. His voice remained calm. Paperwork is not what is stopping this tank. The words tightened Ethan's jaw. Around him, the technicians stood near carts loaded with digital meters, fiber optic testers, and neatly labeled replacement modules. Every tool represented training, procedure, and certainty. Walter had brought none of those things. His leather bag rested on the floor behind the yellow line, its surface darkened by decades of oil and weather. You think you can diagnose a modern armored system by touching the hull? Ethan asked. Walter's eyes shifted toward him. No, I think the hull is telling us what your test equipment missed. Claire climbed down from the platform and pulled the vibration record onto the larger screen. The graph showed a brief rise just before the 2 lock signals separated. It was small enough to disappear among the normal movement of the turret, but now that Walter had pointed them toward it, the pattern was impossible to ignore. It happens at the same position every time, she said, and only during deceleration. Ethan stepped closer. The anger in his face gave way to calculation. He enlarged the graph, studied the timing, and ran the sequence against the previous 2 failures. The peaks aligned almost perfectly. Walter watched him work without satisfaction or impatience. He was not trying to win an argument. He was waiting for the younger man to see what had already been there. The computer receives a locked signal, Ethan said slowly, then loses it for less than half a second. Long enough to protect the system, Walter replied. Not long enough to fail a bench test. Claire looked toward the sealed cover. So the switch works when there is no movement, but something allows it to release when the turret settles. Walter nodded. That is what I would check. Ethan glanced at the clock mounted above the bay doors. 78 minutes remained before the evaluation team arrived. Beyond the hangar, engines turned over in the motor pool as other crews prepared their vehicles. The sound rolled across the concrete like distant thunder. We open it, Ethan said at last. Sergeant Bennett, record the procedure. Martinez, bring the approved tool set. No one touches a component until we photograph its position. The team moved quickly. Claire documented the seals, marked each fastener, and removed the outer cover under Ethan's supervision. When the panel came free, a compact arrangement of levers, switches, and return mechanisms appeared beneath it, all clean and apparently undamaged. Ethan shined a light into the housing. Nothing is broken. Walter stepped to the edge of the open assembly. He did not reach inside. He listened as Claire pressed the locking lever and released it. The mechanism snapped back with a crisp metallic click. Ethan looked at Walter. Normal. Walter shook his head. Do it again. Claire pressed and released it a second time. The clicks sounded the same to everyone else. Walter's expression changed by almost nothing. Slower, he said. Claire repeated the motion. This time, after the first click, There came another sound, faint and late, like a fingernail touching glass. Walter looked at Ethan. There. That is the sound your computer has been blamed for. Claire leaned closer to the open housing and pressed the lever once more. The first click was sharp and immediate. The second arrived a fraction of a second later, softer, almost hidden beneath the ventilation fans. Ethan reached past her and moved the mechanism himself. That could be normal play, he said. Walter kept his eyes on the return arm. Normal play repeats the same way every time. That sound changes with pressure. Ethan released the lever twice, then a third time. Each return looked complete. The position sensor shows a full lock. Until the turret settles, Walter said. Then the arm moves backward just far enough to separate the contacts. Ethan pointed toward the compact sensor mounted beside the linkage. That sensor is new. We replaced it yesterday. I did not say the sensor was bad. Walter lifted one weathered finger toward the narrow return assembly. The computer sees what the sensor tells it. The sensor tells it what the mechanism allows. You keep questioning the messenger while the message is changing underneath it. The technicians had gone quiet. Even those who had smiled at Walter earlier were now studying the assembly with careful attention. Claire brought up the signal trace on a portable display and placed it beside the open panel. The first pulse confirms the lock, she said. The second pulse cancels it. Exactly, Walter replied. Ethan looked between the graph and the linkage. Then why does it pass every manual test? Walter glanced toward the massive turret above them. Because your hand does not weigh several tons, and this concrete floor does not move like a tank crossing rough ground. A weak return can look perfect when nothing is shaking. Ethan straightened. You are describing an old mechanical failure in a digitally monitored system. Digital monitoring does not remove springs, pins, or gravity. Walter's tone never sharpened, but the words carried across the bay. It only gives their mistakes a number. A technician near the tool cart lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Ethan noticed, and his expression hardened. And what qualifies you to make that judgment, he asked. This is not a museum vehicle. The control architecture has been updated more than once since the early models. Walter looked at the tank rather than at him. Steel still expands when it gets hot. Vibration still loosens what looks tight. A tired spring still returns slower than a good one. That is not a credential. No, Walter said. It is an observation. The answer irritated Ethan more than any boast could have. Walter had offered no rank, no resume, and no story. He had simply predicted the failure twice and explained the signal conflict before anyone else had recognized it. Claire reached into the housing with an approved inspection tool and applied gentle pressure to the return arm. The mechanism held. She increased the pressure slightly, then released it. The lever moved forward, paused, and drifted back by barely the width of a pencil line. The sensor indicator flickered. Ethan saw it. His face changed. Do that again. Claire repeated the test. The indicator turned green, flashed amber, then returned to green. Walter nodded toward the screen. There is your computer fault. Ethan crouched beside the housing, no longer looking at Walter as an intruder. What causes the delay, he asked. Walter stepped closer. The smell of warm oil and steel rose from the open assembly. He placed 2 fingers against the edge of the metal cover, and the faint tremor beneath them pulled something old from the silence of his memory. A return spring that has forgotten how to return, he said. The faint vibration beneath Walter's fingertips deepened, and the bright maintenance bay faded from his sight. In its place came a colder night beneath a desert sky, more than 3 decades earlier, when the horizon was a black line and the wind pushed fine sand against every exposed surface. Walter had been 44 then, a master sergeant with tired eyes, steady hands, and a reputation for hearing trouble before an instrument could name it. An Abrams sat alone beside a field maintenance shelter, its engine running but its turret system refusing to complete the startup sequence. The crew had already changed a control unit. Then they had changed a sensor. Nothing had worked. A young lieutenant named Thomas Reed stood nearby, checking his watch as the eastern sky slowly began to pale. Their column was scheduled to move before first light. Every minute mattered, but Walter had ignored the pressure and placed one hand against the access housing. The same pattern had reached him through the steel. One clean movement, one pause, one weak return. The diagnostic equipment had blamed the control unit because the control unit recorded the disagreement. Walter had opened the linkage cover and found a small spring that still looked perfect. It was not broken. It was not bent. It simply no longer had enough strength to hold the return arm in place when the vehicle vibrated. The spring had passed every stationary inspection and failed only when the machine behaved like a machine instead of a diagram. Walter had replaced it with one from a common field kit. The system had turned green before the first edge of sunlight crossed the sand. Lieutenant Reed had looked at the discarded spring in Walter's palm and asked how something so small could silence something so powerful. Walter had answered, "Machines do not care what a part costs. They only care whether it does its job." The memory released him. Bay 4 returned in pieces. White lights, warm steel, the smell of hydraulic fluid, and Claire Bennett's hand resting near the open assembly. Walter removed his fingers from the housing. Ethan was watching him now, his earlier impatience replaced by a guarded curiosity. "You have seen this before," Ethan said. Walter looked at the return arm. "A long time ago. On an Abrams. On one that had fewer screens and the same laws of motion." Ethan glanced toward the clock. 64 minutes remained before the evaluation team arrived. "Can you prove it is the spring without removing it?" Walter nodded toward Claire. "Measure its return force. Then warm the housing and test it again under vibration." Claire retrieved a calibrated force gauge while another technician positioned an approved heat source near the assembly. The metal temperature rose gradually. Claire pressed the linkage, released it, and watched the reading fall below specification. Ethan repeated the test himself. The result was the same. Under simulated vibration, the arm drifted backward and the sensor flickered. No one spoke for several seconds. The expensive computers had not failed. They had been reporting the truth all along. Ethan stared at the small coil hidden inside the mechanism. "How much does that spring cost?" Claire checked the parts catalog on her tablet. 23 cents under the current supply contract. Walter looked at the two replacement computers waiting on padded carts. "Then you have spent a great deal of money proving a 23-cent part is tired." Ethan continued staring at the tiny spring as though its price had made the diagnosis less believable. 23 cents sat between a failed readiness evaluation and two control computers that had been removed without cause. Around him, the maintenance crew waited for a decision. Claire held the force gauge at her side. Walter stood beyond the open housing, quiet and patient, while the clock above the bay doors continued its steady advance. 58 minutes remained. "We have evidence of reduced return force," Claire said. "We should replace the spring and run the full sequence." Ethan looked toward the padded cart where a third control computer waited inside its protective case. Its installation had already been approved. The paperwork was signed. The replacement spring, however, belonged to a different level of maintenance authorization. "We cannot install an unverified part based on one field test," he said. Claire's expression tightened. "The part is below specification. Under heated vibration that we created outside the standard procedure." Walter lifted his eyes toward Ethan. "The tank creates heat and vibration every time it moves." Ethan turned to him. "And if we replace the spring, close the assembly, and the fault remains, we will have lost another half hour." "If you install the third computer," Walter said, "you will lose the same half hour and learn nothing new." The truth of it settled heavily over the bay. Ethan knew it. Claire knew it. Every technician who had watched the signal flicker knew it. Still, responsibility did not feel like truth when a career was attached to the decision. Ethan closed the parts catalog on the tablet and gave the order to prepare the third computer. A low murmur moved through the crew. Claire stepped closer. "Sir, the failure follows mechanical movement. The computers are not causing it. We follow the approved diagnostic tree," Ethan replied. "That is the process." Walter reached down and picked up his leather tool bag. The handle creaked softly in his hand. "A process should lead you toward the answer," he said, "not protect you from seeing it." Ethan's face hardened. "Seal the linkage housing. Begin the computer installation." Claire did not move at first. Then discipline took over. She photographed the assembly, replaced the cover, and marked each fastener. The team lifted the third computer from its case and carried it toward Sabre 12. Walter stepped back behind the yellow line. He did not argue. Again, he simply watched as cables were disconnected, connectors inspected, and the new unit seated into place. 41 minutes remained when Ethan initiated the startup. Green indicators appeared across the screen. The turbine's low hum filled the bay. The turret control came online. Ethan released a breath he had been holding. "Run the alignment sequence," he said. Claire placed her hand on the controls. The turret rotated left, then began its return towards center. Walter looked at the clock, then at the steel cover hiding the weakened spring. His voice was barely above the sound of the machinery. 3. Claire heard him. 2. Ethan turned. 1. The turret stopped. For a brief instant, every indicator remained green. Then the faint delayed click came from inside the housing. The warning tone sounded, and the third computer painted the screen red. The red warning filled the screen with a certainty no one could dismiss. Ethan stood motionless beside the control station while the third computer produced the same fault as the first two. The technicians avoided his eyes. Across the bay, Walter remained behind the yellow line, his leather tool bag resting against his boot. He had not smiled. He had not needed to. "Shut the system down," Ethan said. His voice had lost its edge. Claire ended the test and watched the turret settle into silence. 36 minutes remained before the evaluation team arrived. "We need authorization to replace the spring," she said. Ethan looked at the sealed linkage cover, then at the three computers now occupying padded carts. "Find me something official," he replied. "A service bulletin, a maintenance notice, anything that supports the diagnosis." Claire moved to the records terminal and searched the current technical library. Nothing appeared under the modern fault code. She removed the digital filter and expanded the search to archived armored vehicle records. Hundreds of scanned documents filled the screen, many written before she had been born. She entered the phrases intermittent lock signal, vibration, and return spring. One old bulletin appeared near the bottom of the list. The file had been converted from a paper report, dated more than 30 years earlier. Claire opened it. The first page described a fault that passed stationary testing but returned during turret movement. The second page warned that technicians could mistakenly replace control equipment because the computer only recorded the final signal conflict. Claire read faster. The recommended procedure matched Walter's instructions exactly. Warm the housing, apply controlled vibration, measure the return force, and inspect the spring before replacing electronic modules. At the bottom of the final page, beneath an faded approval stamp, was the name of the field technician who had submitted the findings. Master Sergeant Walter J. Mercer. Claire looked across the bay. The quiet old man stood with one hand resting on the worn handle of his bag, watching the tank instead of the people around it. "Ethan," she said. He joined her at the terminal. His eyes moved down the document and stopped at the signature. For several seconds, he said nothing. "This procedure became part of the maintenance archive because of him," Claire said. Ethan looked toward Walter, and for the first time, he seemed to see more than an elderly visitor in faded work clothes. Claire opened the authorization directory. The archived bulletin required command approval because the current manual no longer listed the spring as an independent field replacement. She called the headquarters maintenance office. A captain answered, listened impatiently, then asked her to repeat the name. "Walter Mercer," Claire said. The line went quiet. A moment later, the captain transferred the call without explanation. Another voice answered, older and controlled. "This is Major General Thomas Reed. Tell me exactly where Master Sergeant Mercer is standing." Claire turned toward the hangar entrance. "Bay 4, sir. Beside Sabre 12. The general's response came without hesitation. "Do not let anyone send him away. I am coming now." Claire lowered the phone and looked toward Walter. "Major General Reed is on his way." The words moved through Bay 4 faster than the warning tone had. Technicians straightened instinctively. Ethan glanced at the clock, then at the sealed linkage housing. 29 minutes remained before the evaluation team arrived. "We cannot wait," he said. He turned to Walter, and the resistance that had shaped every earlier word was gone. "Master Sergeant Mercer, will you guide us through the replacement?" Walter studied him for a moment. "Sergeant Bennett should do the work." Claire looked surprised. Walter nodded toward the tank. She found the record. She felt the delay. She needs to know what correct feels like. Ethan authorized the procedure. The crew reopened the housing with quiet precision. Claire removed the retaining pin, eased the return arm forward, and exposed the small spring beneath it. Under the white lights, the part appeared ordinary. There was no visible break, no dramatic bend, only a slight dullness where the metal had rubbed against its seat. Walter stood beside her without crossing into her workspace. Press the arm down, he said. Claire applied steady pressure. Now let it return, but close your eyes. She did. The spring pushed the arm forward, paused, and settled late. I feel it, she said. It hesitates. Walter opened his leather tool bag and removed a small measuring pick, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. He pointed to the spring seat. The coil has shifted out of its proper groove. Heat weakened it, and vibration taught it a new resting place. Claire checked the parts kit. A replacement spring rested inside a clear envelope no larger than her palm. The printed supply price read 23 cents. She installed it, reset the retaining pin, and pressed the mechanism again. This time the return was immediate. One clean movement. One sharp click. No second sound followed. Walter nodded. That is what the computer has been waiting to hear. The cover was secured, the seals documented, and the system powered on. Green indicators spread across the screen. Ethan watched without breathing. Claire rotated the turret left, guided it back toward center, and stopped 2 degrees short. Walter did not count aloud this time. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The display remained green. Claire completed the full alignment sequence. The turret moved through its entire arc with a deep, controlled hum. No warning appeared. The turbine settled into a steady note that filled the hangar and vibrated through the concrete floor. A vehicle approached outside. Major General Thomas Reed entered Bay 4 with 2 officers behind him, but he stopped before anyone announced him. His eyes found Walter beside the open tool bag. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away from both men. Reed walked across the bay, came to attention, and raised a formal salute. Master Sergeant Mercer, he said, his voice carrying above the engine. The last time I heard an Abrams sound this healthy, you had just taught me the same lesson in the desert. Walter returned the salute slowly. Around them, every technician stood silent, while Sabre 12 continued running, its most expensive systems restored by the smallest part in the bay. Walter lowered his hand from the salute, and Major General Thomas Reed did the same. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The steady turbine note filled the space between them, deep and even, while Sabre 12 completed another fault-free systems check. Reed looked toward the open maintenance records on the terminal, then at the 3 control computers resting on padded carts. How many did they replace? He asked. Ethan answered before anyone else could. 3, sir. The general turned toward him. There was no anger in his face, only disappointment sharpened by experience. And how many were defective? Ethan looked at the green display. None, sir. Reed nodded slowly. Then remember what failed here today? It was not the equipment. The word struck harder because he did not raise his voice. Ethan stepped toward Walter. His shoulders no longer carried the rigid certainty they had when the old veteran first entered the bay. Master Sergeant Mercer, I owe you an apology. I saw outdated clothes, an old tool bag, and someone who was not listed on my work order. I decided what you knew before I listened to you. Walter studied him with the same calm attention he had given the tank. You trusted your training. I used it to stop learning, Ethan replied. Walter gave one small nod. It was not forgiveness offered from above. It was recognition between 2 men who understood that mistakes only became permanent when pride protected them. Claire removed the weakened spring from the inspection tray and placed it in Walter's palm. It looked almost weightless against his weathered skin. Reed smiled faintly. I remember asking you how a part that small could stop an Abrams. You were younger then, Walter said. And louder. A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the bay, easing the tension without breaking the respect that had settled over the crew. Walter turned to Claire and held out the spring. Keep it. She accepted it carefully. Why me? Because you checked the evidence after everyone else had chosen an answer. He looked toward the terminal where his old bulletin remained open. Documents preserve procedures. People preserve judgment. You will need both. Outside, the evaluation convoy approached along the motor pool road. Tires moved over concrete. Radios carried clipped instructions, and late afternoon sunlight spilled through the hangar doors in long bands of gold. Ethan ordered the unnecessary computers tagged for testing and return. Then he asked Claire to add the spring inspection to the local diagnostic sequence so the next crew would not repeat the same error. Walter closed his leather bag and lifted it from the floor. Reed offered to have a vehicle take him anywhere on the base. Walter shook his head. I came to hear the old machine run. Sabre 12 rolled forward under its own power, its tracks turning with measured weight as it crossed into the sunlight. Every indicator remained green. Walter watched until the tank cleared the bay, then walked toward the open doors. No one stopped him this time. Behind him, Claire held the tiny spring beside the glowing computer screen, and Ethan finally understood the lesson that no technical manual could teach by itself. Technology remembers numbers. Experience remembers what made them.